Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So we are going to look at the chapter 1, House of Debt by Mian and Sufi. I'm assuming everybody has actually read this chapter, so we are going to do a meta-analysis. Not actually explain what the chapter is, but talk about why the chapter is written in the way that it is written. So, it starts with a section in which the Mian Sufi describe large unexpected layoffs of large numbers of workers in the recreational vehicle industry that was supposedly recession proof. And he describes the massive amount of social damage and economic loss, and then he asks, why did this happen? So this is the right way to start any subject. This is something which is very important to understand. Why are we studying this? Whatever we are studying, it should have some relation to human life. You start writing down equations on the board, then the standard way the subject is taught is, okay, it's learn the equation, later we will tell you how this applies, and that later never comes. So this is a deception, because that stuff is. So actually we will discuss why later on in this lecture. So first thing you have to do to make a subject interesting and actually relevant is that this material is needed to solve this problem. Then you have to see, is this a problem that I'm interested in solving? So then if it is something that is interesting to you, then you would want to study how to solve that problem. So this is a problem of general interest, where large numbers of people get unemployed, then everybody suffers. Now, in Western methodology of education, there is a big difference between theory and practice. So we study the theory, and actually the theoretician never needs to practice. The standard theory of economics is that I will tell you the theory, and the policy maker will make the decisions and involve the norms. In statistics, you give me the numbers, and I will do the analysis, and then you can take my analysis and do with it whatever you want to do. And similarly, economics, I will teach you the theory. If you ask, well, what happened in the Great Depression? Well, that's applied. You ask the person in the applied department. So, I am saying that this is wrong, and this is actually impossible, in the sense that theory cannot be done in isolation from practice. This is what I discussed in this lecture on entanglement, that theory comes out of practice. Theory cannot be understood without the data or experience that it is trying to analyze. Every theory is based on the analysis of some historical experience, and the theory cannot be understood in isolation, detached from that historical experience. But standard methodology says otherwise. Standard methodology says that you can study theories in isolation. So the authors, after they discuss this, then they discuss the section 1, and they say that basically Keynes was faced with a similar situation, and he wrote his general theory. But today we have an advantage over Keynes. We have a large amount of data, and so we can do much better analysis. And basically the questions that we want to ask is, why do severe recessions happen? What could have prevented the Great Recession? And how can we prevent these crises in general? And so the authors say this book provides answers to these questions based on empirical evidence. Lots of people, millions of people who lost jobs, they deserve an explanation, and what we can do to avoid this kind of event in the future. So now the title of the book is taken from a story about Sherlock Holmes. And in this story, Sherlock Holmes says that it is a big mistake to theorize before one has data. So first you have to have data, and then you build theories, and basically they are following this paradigm that we will study the facts first, then we will develop theories. So let's begin by collecting facts. But actually, this whole concept is wrong. I mean, what Sherlock Holmes is saying is absolutely wrong, 100%. This is the concept of Baconian science. As I said, entanglement, before the theories, actually you use theories to select your facts. And so facts and theories are intertwined. So you can't gather facts because there are hundreds of thousands of facts. So first you have an idea in your mind, and then you collect facts relevant to that idea, and if it doesn't work out, then you change your theory and you collect a different set of facts, but you cannot get all the facts down ever. So you have to, the facts you select must be guided by a theory. So there is continuous interplay between theories and facts. This is actually the scientific method that we look at the world already in light of some theories, and then when we look at the world we find that some of our theories are not working. So if they don't work, then we modify them, and then we check them again. So there is a continuous interplay, theory, fact, and this is how science works. But economists don't use this scientific methodology. They use what is called the Greek axiomatic method, which is also called axiomatic deductive method. So what they do is that let's start with some axioms which are self-evident, known, obvious, true, and then we use logic to deduce. This is like geometry. You had some axioms, and then you derived some properties of triangles and parallel lines and this, that, and the other. This was not done by any examination of real-world triangles, or you did not get your theories from the data. You got your theories from the mind. So this is the axiomatic method, but this is not the scientific method. But due to certain mistakes in Western intellectual tradition, they got confused about what the scientific method is. And because they never understood what the scientific method is, actually not currently, but the logical positivists thought that the scientific method was actually the axiomatic deductive method. But it was not. And so today economics is done in this way, that you start by axioms and then you derive theorems, and you think that this is science, but in fact it is not. This is the pre-scientific method, which was rejected by Muslims. So actually science, very briefly, science originated in the Islamic civilization. Science is a radical break from the axiomatic deductive method. For 100 years, for centuries, there was a debate among the Greeks about whether the light comes from the object and hits the eye, or whether it's the opposite. And both sides had axiomatic deductive proofs for their own propositions, and so nobody could actually decide So Ibn al-Haytham resolved this matter by looking at empirical data for the first time. He said that when you look at the sun, it burns your eyes. So the light is coming from the sun. And he made many other observations like this. So this is very different. You don't have any axioms. The problem with the axiomatic method when it comes to natural science is that the truth about nature is not intuitively obvious. And so you can't find any axioms. So you look at the world and you see some things which may be true. You make a guess about some law, and then you test it, and usually it fails, and then you refine the law, and this keeps on happening. So your theories are always designed to match the best available empirical observations. This is how science works. But this is very different from the axiomatic methodology, where you set your axioms and then you never change, and you never look at the data. You never actually test your Pythagorean theorem by drawing a triangle and seeing if it works, because you have a logical proof of this. So something very strange is that science was imported into Europe from Al-Andalus, but scientific methodology was never understood from day one. And this is true to this day. And that gives us a great opportunity, in the sense that by correctly applying the scientific method to economics, we can make a lot of progress very quickly. Even now, what Mian and Sufi are saying about science in this book is not correct. So the standard methodology of economics today is based on the following ideas: that every agent must maximize an objective function. This is taken for granted. It's not subject to test. And when it is tested, it fails. But because this is an axiom, they say, well, our theory is based on this axiom. Whether or not it's true is irrelevant. So, okay, everyone is maximizing. So maximizing means that you're exerting some force, now in the physics analogy. So basically equilibrium is when all forces balance, and so you are in a situation at rest. So basically the standard economic methodology is based on every agent applies some force. This force is described by a maximization of some objective function, and then you study the equilibrium of the system. This is basically 19th century physics. Physics itself changed a lot since then. So in this methodology, there is never any need to observe actual behavior of household and firm, because you already know that they are maximizing an objective function, and in fact you even know the objective function. So you don't ever need to ask people, or you don't even need to look at how people behave, because you already know that in advance. So that's the axiomatic method. Now Keynes studied the actual behavior, and so a lot of his theories are much better adapted to the reality of what happens. Mian and Sufi also say that let's do this, let's follow the scientific method, let's look at observations and then build our theories. But this is only a partial and incomplete understanding of how the scientific method works. So this is my advice to you. If you want to understand things, you have to follow this forest and tree principle. Always you have to think at two levels at the same time. If you have a law, you do not understand the law unless you can translate it into specific, concrete, particular details, how it works on the ground. If you have a general idea, this is how things work, but you cannot translate it into particular, then you don't understand it, and then there is no such law. So facts, to understand theories you have to have facts. But also the reverse is true. You cannot understand facts without theories, because facts is just a sequence of events. First, people had mortgages, then there were derivatives, and then there was this, that, and the other. But why did it happen? That's not there in the facts. The driving forces of the system, we have studied in Minsky, the financial fragility. So there are certain forces where the banks are trying to make profits. Now this trying to make profits, this is not there in the facts. You just have a list of data about this. This is the collection of what the profits were. But the fact that firms were trying to make profits and that led them to deceive people, this is not there. This is something that you have to provide. So, and you have to have theories to link the facts together in a coherent sequence. Otherwise you can say X happened, Y happened, without having an understanding. And this is what was happening in the presentations that you gave them. This is what the Argentina crisis was. First this happened, then that happened, and that happened. But there was no reflection of any understanding of why it happened. Why it happened is not there in the sequence of facts. So, to understand facts, you have to have theories. To understand theories, you have to have facts. Theories are always about unobservable factors. So this is one of the major problems that economists have, that the logical positivists say that you should only talk about observables, never talk about unobservables. In this whole today's world, the business theory is going by this positivist idea that we should have measurable outcomes and we should. But actually, you see, the real incentives are unmeasurable. So now we say to a worker that, okay, I'm going to monitor the amount of work that you do, and I'm going to give you a reward which is based on the how much work you do. So this fails to understand the person. Now what will happen, and what does happen really, is that people start doing shoddy work. They focus on what can be observed. If there is if there is an unobservable quality component, that will go to waste, and they will just produce the maximum number, or they will play the numbers instead of doing the real thing. Just like when you say that we are going to measure the number your research by the number of publications you produce, then people start publishing junk. Whereas if we try, and the research is not the number of publications, this is just an indicator. So indicators are different from reality. Reality is always unobserved. If you focus on indicators instead of on reality, you will make huge mistakes, and that's what's happening today. So the forest is really in our minds. It's not there in the trees. It's a principle of organization. It's a theory. It's not there. It's a coherence, a collectivity that's created by a theory. So you have to have both. So all right. So understanding is always at the forest level, and the facts are always at the tree level. So understanding always goes beyond the facts. All right, so we come to the section 2 of Mian and Sufi, and they say let's start by collecting the facts, and this is the first fact that they show you. This is the US household debt to income ratio. Now this already shows the problem that I'm trying to illustrate. That where did they get this graph? There's thousands of things that you could look at in the global financial crisis. You could look at the number of derivatives, you could look at credit, you could look at hundreds of other factors. This is what they focus on. Why do they focus on this? Because they have a theory in mind, and which they explain later on. So they have a particular theory about how it happened. This theory comes from the first depression, the Fisher Debt-Deflation theory. So they had already a guess as to what might be happening, and so they're looking at the data that will confirm or deny their theory. If, in fact, they had in mind the debt deflation theory, which they did, then and this graph would have been flat, then they would have said, oh, our theory is wrong, let's look for some other theory. And then there are many other theories of the deflation, of the Great Depression, so they could have picked up something else and then looked at the data for that, and finally they would have had something where. So here it seems like, if you look at the data, that the debt to GDP ratio is rising slowly until 2000, and then the slope of the rise increases until the crisis, and then it decreases. So they give some figures that in the period between 2000 and 2007, the total amount of debt doubled, and the debt income ratio skyrocketed from 1.4 to 2.1. So why do we focus on debt GDP? Because of the debt deflation theory. In fact, if you look at mainstream macro, it says that debt, credit, money are not relevant. And real business cycle theory says debt doesn't matter, because what they look at is the aggregate amount of money. So if I have a debt, then somebody else has the money. So in aggregate, debts cancel, so debt doesn't matter. So if somebody has this theory, they will never look at the debt. You say, okay, this is yes, maybe debt was rising. If you look at the data, you say, okay, debt was rising, probably there was some reason for it, but doesn't have anything to do with the crisis, because economic phenomena, the real business cycle, does not depend on debt. So if you say it doesn't depend on money, money is just a veil. So what's happening to money doesn't matter. You take the money out, then you will understand. So this is just a illusion. Yes, it can happen that debt increased a lot. There was some other phenomena that was going on in the economy, and that caused. In fact, when people went to ask, what's his name, Fama, I think, about what happened in the global financial crisis. So he said that I can explain to you. He said he gave some data that the real business cycle was going bad, and because the forecasters in the stock market are very smart, they saw that now the economy is going to turn down, and then they started selling out stocks, and that led to the collapse. So basically it's so the financial phenomena is just a reflection of what was really happening in the real world. So they said that, well, okay, so you think that the collapse of the stock markets was caused by the, so now what caused the real downturn in the real business cycle? They know, who knows? That's something that nobody knows. So the facts that we look at depend on the theories that we believe. And at the moment, the Mian and Sufi are trying to push the theory that debt is the most important variable. So in order to push this theory further, you have to, this is just, so far we just have a correlation. And we saw that in 2007, the global financial crisis occurred, and we also saw that the debt increased. Now, who knows what, is this an irrelevant phenomenon? These two things happened at the same time? Or is there a causal relationship? Did the debt cause the crisis? Or maybe it was, as Fama says, that the crisis caused the debt. That people anticipated that there would be a crisis, and they took some actions which would lead to the increase in debt. So to get some more evidence, we look at what happened in the Great Depression. And so we see that the run-up to the increase in the debt, we look for other places. So if this debt to GDP ratio just keeps varying randomly over time periods, then this is just a correlation. This is just a correlation unimportant. So if we see in history that from time to time debt to GDP ratio increases a lot and then it comes down and nothing happens, then we will say that it cannot be the cause of the crisis. So we look through history and we see that no, this debt GDP ratio has never risen up by this much, except for one period which was just prior to the Great Depression. Now the correlation is becoming stronger, that yes, there is some relationship between these two. So it's not just an accident that these two things happened at the same time. So you look at the data and you find that there was a massive increase in mortgage debt between 1920 to 1929, just before the crisis. So this strengthens the more data on this. You find that partially there was a history of consumer credit, that installment sales started the first time in 1920s. This was called the Roaring Twenties. You could buy furniture on debt. Previously to that, you did not buy things except houses on debt. So society's attitude towards debt changed. So now this is again an observation. Why did it happen? Well, there are deeper reasons. Why did banks start lending? Why was installment financing invented? Basically, you have to invoke financial instability hypothesis. When the economy is stable, as it was over that period, the banks will take more risk, will extend more credit. That's one of the factors. Also, the Federal Reserve Bank was created in 1914, and that gave banks an additional stability. They could issue credit, they could take a lot of risk, they could increase their reserves of lending, and if the bank was to collapse, then the Federal Reserve's job was to bail them out. So it was possible for them to make loans, and they make profit only by making loans. So they had a tremendous incentive to make loans. Now this is not going to be there in the data. This is something that you have to understand the mechanism there. So once they said, okay, now we can make loans without any fear of collapse. Prior to that, the banks were constrained by the fear of collapse. Banks could issue credit, but they could also be a bank run. But now they said that now there cannot be any bank run because the Federal Reserve will bail us out. So we can extend credit, and you make a lot of money when you extend credit because you lend something you don't have, and you make money on it. So you have a product that is zero cost to manufacture, and that you get money by selling. So obviously it's in the great incentive of banks to make as much loans as possible. So then you try to make loans, you try to popularize loans. So you try to get people to buy things on loans. And this is why credit cards were invented, and this is why installment sales were invented. So this is the underlying mechanism which is not there in the data. You will never see this in the data. But you need to you need to have this to understand. So going back to Mian and Sufi, they are talking about the data, and they say, well, in the period at hand, there was in the global financial crisis, as debt increased, savings decreased, and the same pattern was seen in before the Great Depression. The personal savings rate fell, and it was said that prosperity in that time was just based on borrowing in the 1920s. So a similar pattern to what happened in the global financial crisis, where household debt increased by a huge amount and household savings fell by a huge amount. In addition, these are some other things that are happening. There was a large decline in aggregate demand. This is something that was noticed by Keynes. Both the recession started out with a very large drop in household spending. So basically, the Monaco Coach Corporation, which was the object of the first section, there was no demand for recreational vehicles. So that's why the company laid off workers, and that's why there was unemployment. So this is the question of why did the aggregate demand fall? And this is basically the question that Keynes was trying to answer. That suddenly we had high aggregate demand and firms were producing a lot of goods, and then suddenly customers stopped coming to the stores to buy. So this is a mystery. Why did people stop coming to buy cars? But when they stopped coming, then there was a response to the fall of aggregate demand. And now when you understand what's happening, then you understand where the Keynesian theory is coming from. When you start looking at the standard book and they start drawing curves and figures, then you don't understand why somebody thought about this in the first place. So these figures and curves are being drawn because we have this phenomena in mind, that suddenly the economy was going booming and everybody was working and lots of goods were producing. Suddenly the stores stopped selling goods, and when the stores stopped selling goods, then the manufacturers said, look, we have our inventories are increasing. This is the first thing that will happen, that you send material to the sellers and they keep some in stock in inventory, and when customers come they sell their inventory and then they order more. Now, but when the inventory is too large, normally you see, if you have your ice cream in the freezer and then every day your delivery truck comes and delivers, so one day you say that today most of the ice cream I had yesterday has not been sold, so I don't want today's order. Then after a while the delivery truck starts bringing less per day because the pattern of demand has changed, and then this gets communicated up the line, and so the factory which was producing starts producing less, and when it starts producing less, then it says that okay, we don't need so many workers, we don't need to buy so much milk. So when you see this happening, then you say, okay, it's aggregate demand which is the driver. It is not that you started firing laborers and then you reduced the goods and then the demand declined somehow. I mean, you observe what's happening and then you construct a theory to match what you see. And when, as they do in economics, they take out the observations and they start with the theory, then you are left in a complete mystery as to why was anybody studying these equations in the first place. But because the standard Western methodology is that theory is in isolation and practice is in isolation, so you never understand that because everything is done that way. So there is more. I mean, this is just some observations, but you have to link it to other factors. And basically, people who have tried to do the linkages have seen that the aggregate demand that declined cannot be explained by the normal factors, that first the income declined and then correspondingly the demand declined. It didn't happen like that. So Atif Mian and Amir Sufi here in the first chapter are building up an argument. They are not displaying facts, which is what they say they are doing. They are building an argument to support a theory which they already have in mind. They started this book with a theory that it's the debt deflation hypothesis of Fisher that's important. And in light of this theory, they are collecting facts. So they say, for example, that there is a huge build-up of debt. And then they look at the debt GDP ratio. Why not look at the debt itself? That would show even a sharper increase because GDP was increasing. So the thing is that all comparisons require two objects. When you say that somebody did very well in the exam, it is in comparison to something else. And this is a very common way to deceive when you do lying by statistics. Then you do a comparison, but you skip the object of comparison. So GDP is a way to scale the debt. The debt is continuously increasing because economy is increasing. So you measure it on the scale of the GDP as just a way of a ruler that if it is GDP is increasing and debt is also increasing at the same rate, then debt is increasing, but it is not increasing unusually or exceptionally. So this is very important. Graphs can also be highly deceptive. We saw that it was going flat and then there was a big jump. But if you change the scale of the graph, you will think of it as flat. It was going from 1.5 to 2.5%. If you make a graph from 0 to 100%, it will look like a straight line. And similarly, you can have smaller blips which are just random noise, and you can make them look significant. So pure data can be used to deceive people. Statistics can be used to deceive people in many ways. So instead of debt GDP ratio, if we use some other scale, we might come up with some other phenomena. The GDP is all in the background. We never noticed that here debt is being compared to GDP. If I could say, okay, let's compare debt to the flow of credit being produced by banks, the picture might look very different. And then we say, oh, look, that doesn't matter. And somebody who was trying to argue that doesn't matter would create such a picture. So, because a lot of elements of the argument are hidden from view, so a lot of deception can take place, and does. So Atif Mian in an interview stated that he admired the Fisherian debt deflation theory, and this debt deflation theory has been updated by Krugman and Koo. So in an interview he was asked, what are some of the papers that you like, and he mentioned these papers. So he has this in mind already, that these are the good theories to try to understand. Okay, then he provides additional support from international experience. So he cites a study by Glick and Lansing which shows that in the lead up to the global financial crisis, the countries with the largest increase in household debt had the largest decline in household spending. Now we are getting to a causal mechanism. First we were just describing that there is this thing that happens, that debt increases and then crises occur. But now we see that the countries which have high debt are the countries which have high collapse in aggregate demand. So now we have a linkage, a chain which connects. So the high debt may lead to collapse of aggregate demand eventually, and that may lead to depression. I have a post on this, why does aggregate demand collapse, and that goes into more details about this mechanism. But you see, we have to go beyond the description to try to put things together and try to sequence and then try to find causal chains, and that's what understanding involves. Why did it happen? And why did it happen is more than just a description that it happened. And even more than, okay, first you have high debt, then you have crisis. That's just a description, doesn't explain what happened. Now when you put in this third factor, that high debt led to shortfall in aggregate demand, that leads to depression. Now you can start to put together a possible causal chain. This is not a causal chain, this is just some more pieces of the puzzle. So there are some more international evidence for this, that household debt increase leads to crisis and collapse. Some more empirical evidence gathered by Mian Sufi. There was a there was a study of recessions in 1990s, and that also found a correlation with debt. Another set of studies by Reinhart and Rogoff. This is an important paper, widely cited. There were 5 big crises: banking crisis, Spain 77, Norway 87, Finland and Sweden in 1991, and Japan in 1992. These recessions were triggered by asset price collapses, meaning housing price bubbles which collapsed, or stock market collapse. That led to massive losses in banking, and these were all followed by deep recessions with slow recoveries. Now we have a empirical pattern. First you have a bubble, then you have a collapse, then you have a recession. Why does it happen? We don't know. That's just to say that this is what happened is not to understand. Everything needs explanation. Why did the bubble take place? Why did it collapse? And what effect does the collapse have on the economy? Does it lead to collapse of aggregate demand? What is aggregate demand? And then does that lead to recession? All of these things require explanation. So the pattern that they show is that the Reinhart Rogoff show that all episodes were preceded by large run-ups in real estate prices and large increases in current account deficits in these countries. Now, one thing that I would like to explain here is that this idea that you have to go beneath the surface to understand is not part of Western methodology. What they think, what Francis Bacon explained as science was that you look at the facts and they fall into a pattern, and that pattern is the law. So there is nothing more. Actually, in my talk on a realist approach to econometrics, I have explained this, that they are the current methodology in economics, and the dominant methodology is what is called nominalist. Nominalist means names only. It means you only look at appearances and you try to talk only about appearances. So econometrics is all based on looking at patterns in the data and trying to find the best fit to the pattern in the data. But I am saying this does not work, it cannot work, and I have a number of articles on econometrics. And the same thing here. Just looking at the facts and trying to find patterns is not enough. It will never lead to understanding. For understanding, you have to look at one level beneath, and that approach is called realist as opposed to nominalist. Realist is not the dominant methodology, even though it makes a huge amount of sense. To be realist, it means that you have to look beneath the surface. Now, the objection to the realist approach is that you can never tell. And this objection, that the real factor, the real cause, is something that cannot be observed. So if it cannot be observed, then you shouldn't be part of a scientific theory. This is a wrong understanding of science, but this is the Baconian understanding of science. So here we're just describing what happened. We're not making guesses about the causes. So there's some more research in this. Schuleric and Taylor. Reinhart and Rogoff didn't look at debt. They looked at other sources, other data series. So Schuleric and Taylor looked at the debt, and they saw that in all of the, not all of the five, but 4 of the 5 crises, there was huge build-up of debt, and they didn't have data for one of them. So on the whole, it seems like debt is an important factor. But this is just a tentative hypothesis. We have now a lot of strong support, and now when we try to find an explanation, we will look for what role debt plays. So the Reinhart-Rogoff results are all about banking crises, and in fact there's a huge number of banking crises. So the issue is it the banking crisis which leads to recession, or is it the debt? So again, they have collected some data, and they find that usually both of them happen. Debt increases a lot and a banking crisis happens. But if a banking crisis happens without too much debt, it doesn't cause much damage. And if a crisis occurs, economic crisis occurs without a banking crisis but high debt, that also causes a lot of damage. So by this kind of data analysis which is discussed here, they say that it's not the banking crisis is not the most important part, it's the debt which is most important, but debt in conjunction with banking crisis causes the maximum amount of damage. Both of these are actually pointers to the theory that they are going to develop, and this book was written after they had the theory in hand. So now they are actually building up to their theory, which is that leveraged debt is the killer. So it's not just debt. Debt is just one for one. I give you $100 which I had. This is the financial intermediate picture. So that doesn't cause a problem. But if I have $10 and I loan you $100 on the basis of this 10, as happens, so that's leveraged debt. Now they say that the real critical factor is leveraged debt. So when you have debt and banking crisis, then you have leveraged debt, and that's the killer. That's what they're going to build up to. But this is, at the moment, it seems like, and they claim that we are just gathering facts, but actually they are gathering facts which are very, very specific and very, very pointed to build support for the theory that they have already got in mind. And they are hiding this theory. That's the problem. Because that means that you don't learn the scientific method when you are studying this book, or when you're studying any economics book. Because let's say we start to study consumer theory. The natural way, the scientific way to do it would be to say, let's look at consumer behavior. We talk about your experiences when you go into a store, what do you do? Then we talk about data sets and surveys, and then we say, okay, now we have this data, now let's think about, and we would, even the initial gathering of data, when we take a survey, we would base it on our own experience about shopping. We would look at the factors that govern my decision, and we would ask questions about that factor. And we might miss something very important because our consumption pattern might not be typical. So that's how one should do theory, but it is never done this way because of wrong methodology. So then Mian and Sufi examine alternative theories. There's the fundamentals view, which is basically your real business cycles, that money, credit, these are just irrelevant. The real issue is the fundamentals of the economy, how much laborers there are, how much capital there is. Every resource automatically gets employed. You have automatic full employment. So because equilibrium works like that. So then this credit business does not matter. There's the animal spirits view. This comes from Keynes. Keynes said that there's a collapse in aggregate demand. What explains it? I don't know. He said that it's expectations. Suddenly people became pessimistic about the future, and then they stopped making investments. That was the component of aggregate demand that he had in mind, that is most autonomous. But actually what we see is that it's the consumption demand that collapsed, not the investment demand. So there is something missing from the Keynesian theory, as we will see. And then there is the banking view. Banking view says that the asset price collapse led to a crunch in liquidity in banks. Banks could not lend money anymore because their assets had collapsed, so they had no base on which to lend. And so this is the key, this is the bloodstream of the economy. You must restore supply of credit you must provide money to the bank so they can lend, and if so the recession is caused by so these are the three alternatives. None of these three have any role of debt. So now the issue is this doesn't mean that these theories are wrong, because any of these theories can be true, and the debt increase can be part of the consequences of what happens when the mechanisms in these theories are played out. Alright, so we will examine the evidence to come up with the right explanation. So this is the end of the first chapter.